Apple just now reporting its Q4 earnings results. Let's get you those numbers right away. Apple reporting on the bottom line, EPS of $1.46. That is a beat. The street was looking for $1.39. Revenue also beating expectations, $89.5 billion. Street was at $89.34 billion. Gross margins also better than expected, 45.2% versus 44.5%. Let's go back product segment here. iPhone revenue, $43.81 billion in the quarter versus an estimate of $43.73 billion. So edging higher than the street was looking for there. Mac, though, comes in lighter, $7.6 billion. Street was closer to $8.76 billion. iPad, they come in at $6.4 billion. The street was at $6.12. Wearables, $9.3 billion in the quarter versus an expectation of $9.41. Services, though, $22.3 billion versus a forecast by the street of $21.36 billion. That, by the way, was an all-time high, Apple saying. I did have the chance to catch up with CFO Luca Maestri. Let me bring you some statements there. First of all, we talked about what demand has been like for the new iPhone 15 lineup so far. Luca Maestri telling Yahoo Finance in September, for those 9 days that the iPhone 15 was in the market, it sold better, he told us, than the iPhone 14 versus last year. And that's true for China as well. He said, we believe we gained market share in China during the September quarter. The initial signals are positive, he said. He added that the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max are currently supply constrained. On China, by the way, obviously a focus for investors. He said we were down 2% in Greater China, but up 3% in constant currency, Akiko.
Yeah, taking a look at the stock move right now, Josh. Apple down just slightly right now. Sure, as you pointed out, sort of better than expected. The street had turned a little bearish, you could argue, in terms of the expectations for the iPhone 15. And yet we are still talking about 4 straight quarters of sales declines. So the market noting that as well. Interesting to hear about what's been playing out in China. And I'm curious if you had that conversation when you spoke to Luca Maestri about what that expectation is. Yes, 2.5% decline when you compare it year on year. Now, how much of this is sort of the macro environment? How much of this is about potential competition they're seeing in the market?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to get a little bit. Remember, we don't have the forecast here or the guidance. And when I asked Luca Maestri about that, he said, listen, we're going to have to wait for the call for that. So maybe some of that color comes out in the call. But you're asking all the right questions. The focus will be on China, what they did this quarter, but also what they're seeing quarters ahead, including, of course, as you mentioned, the competition there. All right, let's move on to dig into the latest quarter from Apple. We're going to have Tom Forte from D.A. Davidson, Managing Director, Senior Research Analyst. Tom, the numbers are out. Interested to get your first look.
Sure. So on first blush, I think investors should be sighing, breathing a sigh of relief here to the extent that results were better than expected, pretty much across the board except for the Max. And so I would say that that's kind of a win on a relative basis, despite the fact that they had their 4th consecutive quarter of declining revenue.
Yeah, Tom, you've been pretty vocal in sort of the pulling back the expectation on the iPhone 15. Number one, there was the issue sort of pricing, that Apple still priced at a higher price point, and then also questions about demand given that. I realize in this quarter, it doesn't give you the full picture of what that demand looks like because it was still early days, but given the numbers that we got today, does that change the way you view the outlook, particularly on the iPhone right now?
It doesn't change the outlook. I think that Apple's still in a position where it can't solely rely on the iPhone to drive shares higher. This is going to put more pressure on the Vision Pro launch at the start of calendar next year. The 2% decline in China, I think, is a concern. And China is about 20% of revenue for Apple. But I think that, again, investors should breathe a sigh of relief to the extent that sales and earnings were better than expected. And there's enough in there to, give some people hope.
Tom, on China specifically, what's the bigger concern for you? Is it about the consumer sentiment, what the macro environment is like, or is it about homegrown competition, particularly around Huawei?
So it's twofold. One, the weak Chinese economy, to the extent that that's a large portion of Apple's revenue. 2, to the extent they're still heavily dependent on China from a supply chain standpoint. And I guess 3, to the extent that you're seeing this, trade war, however you want to think about the tensions between the U.S. and China, and that seems to be escalating, and Apple's caught right in the middle. So multiple challenges for Apple in China right now.
Talk to me, Tom, too. Listen, we're waiting for the call in which we'll get a lot more insight and guidance, color and commentary from Tim Cook and Luca Maestri about the outlook there. I was interested about margins, though, Tom, hanging in there. They clocked in for the September quarter at 45.2%. The street was closer to 44.5%. I'm interested, what do you think the puts and takes are there? Where do you think gross margins could go from here?
So generally speaking, I think the fact that they had better than expected iPhone sales, that tends to be one of their higher margin hardware items. And then also to the extent that their services revenue exceeded expectations, that's very important for margin. So the question then is, what are the expectations for the higher margin categories, iPhones and services in the December quarter? So look forward to additional details on the call in that regard.
We should point out Apple shares now down about 1.2%, or just about 1% right now on the back of those results. Tom, if it's not about the iPhone 15, what are the additional levers, do you think, that could push this stock higher?
Yeah, so I definitely think that they're going to need either the Chinese economy to materially improve or relations between the U.S. and China to improve. Otherwise, I think it's going to be harder to the extent that they're going to need the Vision Pro to exceed expectations. I think with a $34.99 price point, they're not going to be able to achieve mass adoption. But essentially, they've fired all their bullets here, and the stock's still not exactly, humming. So they're going to need either something to improve in China or the Vision Pro to materially outperform against expectations, which I think will be difficult.
And Tom, when we just spoke to CFO Luca Maestri and we were talking to him about the Mac specifically, and I did ask him, listen, the quarter Mac revenue came in here, Tom, around $7.6 billion. That did miss. The street was closer to around $8.8 billion. And I asked Maestri about that. He said, in part, what we're dealing with here is just tough comps. They did just introduce, Tom, as you know, they had their event. They've got new product. Do you think that new product could provide a tailwind for the Mac business?
The answer is no. So I liked how they had it, scary fast, and it was the day before Halloween. The challenge for Apple and others, especially as it pertains to laptops and consumer electronics in general, is you had a huge pull forward in the early stages of COVID. That's proven to be a problem even for Apple. Apple gets about 20% of their revenue from laptops and from tablets, and that 20% of revenue could continue to be under duress until consumers decide to spend again on consumer electronics. When that happens, it's not clear today.
And Tom, you're on a neutral right now on the stock. What would get you to move to a buy, Tom? What do you need to see?
So I'd either like to see a pretty significant pullback to make it more exciting. From a valuation standpoint, it's still an amazing company, has a tremendous balance sheet. Otherwise, I'd like to see the two things that I pointed out earlier: some sort of progress in China, either the economy is improving or relations between the two governments are improving. And then, the harder to imagine, better than expected performance for Vision Pro when they launch it next year. It's an important next step for Apple to be less dependent on the iPhone. Those are the things that would get me more excited about stock.
Finally, Tom, this current quarter is, at least historically, the biggest one for Apple. Given where the numbers are across the portfolio for the company, how do you think this sets things up going into the holiday season?
I think it's challenging for Apple and everyone to the extent that I think if you looked at, for example, the mega sale that Amazon had and the outlook Amazon had for the December quarter, they had clearly a pull forward in demand. You're seeing a very highly promotional environment. It's having a tremendous negative impact on Etsy, as an example. So I think even Apple's going to have some challenges when it comes to holiday spend in the December quarter.
Tom Forte, thank you so much for your time today, Tom. Appreciate it.
Thank you.